Tape Deck Media.
Hi there, I am Kelly Zemnikas, and I am the host of a brand new podcast called Holler and Wine. I'm a stand-up comedian, I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I genuinely love talking to people. And despite the fact that I do not care for the sound of my own voice, I've got a podcast now. So please come join us. We're going to have really good conversations. We're going to talk about cocktails, and I am going to give my guests a tarot card reading because why not? So join us on Holler and Wine. Hope to see you soon. Well, it's a podcast, so it's hear you soon? That sounds weird.
We got the riddles that'll make it chat. Oh yeah, baseline stuff with groove is tight. Get your funk on, we're rocking tonight. One more time.
Good morning, Roddlers. Welcome back to episode 96 of Ruddle Me This. With you, as always, Hugo Boss himself, Taylor Ruddle. Delighted to be here. Back for another week with a really interesting conversation that I had with my guest. This date, it was several weeks ago, but it was a fantastic conversation we had. I am somewhat winding down for the year, I suppose you could say. I don't have any massive projects in the works at the moment. I think we are looking at possibly doing another fundraiser for the Cancer Society, hopefully before the end of the year. So if you want to find out more about that, by the time this episode drops, it may actually be coming up pretty soon. So go along to the Facebook page, Can Do Comedy, and see if we've got anything cooking. Actually, one plug I can get in, apart from the normal gigs: Tuesday quiz at Archie Brothers, Wednesday quiz at Moi Moi, Thursday comedy show at Austin Club. We're also running one called Punday Monday, which is going to be at Crafted Coffee Company, which is owned by Mark Churnside, whose episode dropped a couple of weeks ago. He's allowing us to run a comedy show that's centered all around puns, one-liners, gags, japes, everything like that. So if you like that, once again, get along to the Can Do Comedy Facebook page and check out the details for that. Alrighty, so on to the introduction for the guest. This guest here it's a bizarre story. So Dan Burgess-Milne is his name, and weirdly enough, he and I actually went to high school together. Well, I don't ever remember us interacting at high school, but we definitely saw each other around. He and I went to a school that's a bit of an, I don't want to say oddity, but it's a different school. It's less structured, I suppose. It still does have some structure, but the students can choose their own classes. It honestly kind of felt like going to university, but with high school subjects. Like, I did a class on chocolate making and that kind of thing. So the school at the time was called Unlimited Pāinga Tawhiti, and I think actually Dan and I were in maybe like the third or the fourth year that the school had been operating. I'm not 100% sure how long it had been around. My brother and I both transferred to that school. I cannot remember what year it was. Maybe 2008 or 9. And we had a cousin who had gone there beforehand and kind of sung its praises and talked about how if you're sort of self-directed, you can achieve quite a bit. And I remember being quite frustrated in the curriculum of the school that I was at. So we ended up asking our parents if they'd transfer us, and they did. And we do talk about that quite a bit because Dan has kept in touch with the school, and it's now just called Owl Tawhiti. And Dan has done a little bit of teaching and such back with them. So we do talk about that a little bit in the episode. And then I randomly had a bunch of the teachers from the school come to one of my pub quizzes. Like, it was either a week before or a week after we recorded this podcast. So I don't know whether that's the universe trying to send me a sign to get back in touch. But anyway, I'm rambling now. Dan, he gave a talk as a part of the Nerd Nite events in Christchurch, which I sort of have a soft agreement with Nicole, the owner, or not the owner, the person who runs and makes everything happen at Nerd Nite, that if the guests would like to talk about their topic on the podcast, she kind of puts them in touch with me. And so Dan was the first person to take me up on this offer. I'll put a link to Dan's talk that he did in the show notes. You can check it out. It was a very good talk. He's a great public speaker. And so, yeah, we chatted a little bit back and forth, and Dan's involved in some really interesting projects to do with kind of like, I guess, spirituality and mindfulness and that sort of thing. He's very much someone who wants to look at the kind of the white picket fence image that we all have of like, this is how your life is supposed to go, quote unquote, like supposed to, and thinking, well, what if we do something differently? He's a very, very interesting guy, very smart guy. I was worried that I wasn't going to be able to keep up with him kind of intellectually, but I don't know, I felt like it was a good back and forth conversation. We sort of framed it like we were going to talk about meditation, but the whole conversation kind of evolved and we ended up talking about all manner of stuff. But I think the main thing that Dan wants to get out there is just encouraging people to think about the world in sort of outside the box ways. The topic of his speech was called Paradigm Shifts, and it was about how we can sort of get out of our frame of reference and think about the universe and physics and everything like that from a different angle. Essentially, I'm very much dumbing it down, but that was kind of the gist of what I got from his speech. And yeah, so we had a very good conversation about that. Whew, that was a long intro. That was a lot longer than I intended it to be. So let's get on with the interview. So please, Rattle Maniacs of all ages, welcome to the show, Dan Burgess-Milne. Okay, Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
It's always, like I say this every time, but it's always bizarre. We've sort of been chatting for 30 minutes or something, and then when you kind of switch the mics on, you have to pretend like you've just sat down together. So good to see you again. This is a sort of first for the podcast, is that Dan and I actually went to high school together and were recently put in touch again by the good folks at Nerd Nite after Dan did a speech. A speech, is that what you call it? A presentation is probably better.
A TED Talk.
TED Talk, yeah. About, I'm not even sure how to encapsulate. The paradigm shift was the name of the speech, wasn't it?
Yeah, shifting paradigms.
And it was about kind of almost physics, right?
Yeah, because that's an area that I have some knowledge in.
Yeah.
Not because it's exclusive to physics as an idea.
Yeah. And thankfully, so I don't think she's listening, but Nicole, thank you for putting me in touch with the guest. You're the first guest that's been offered the podcast from Nerd Nite and actually taken me up on it. So
right.
Breaking all sorts of records today. I quite enjoyed your speech. Some of it, I will admit, was a little bit over my head, but I think I get the gist of what you were talking about there. And then just sort of serendipitously, I was chatting to my cousin a few days ago, and he started talking about this paradigm shift, and I thought, this sounds really familiar. And I thought, wait a second, this sounds a lot of what Dan's speech was about. So sent him your presentation, and he quite enjoyed it. And yeah, so he didn't have any questions for me to follow up on it, but I guess let's talk a little bit about your presentation. So what inspired you initially to sign up to Nerd Nite and give the talk?
Well, initially it was really just responding to the request. I bumped into Nicole at a networking event, and she's great. She seems to be that kind of person that just catalyzes things into action.
Makes things happen, yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. And so we had a thoroughly enjoyable talk. And she asked if I wanted to do a talk. And I guess, my background's in meditation, and the idea there is if someone makes a request and you feel that you can meet that, then you just do your best to meet that request.
Really?
So I sent her a list of a few different things that I thought I might be able to do an entertaining enough talk on, and she chose that one.
Right, so it was actually selected by Nicole. Interesting.
Yeah, well, I think she, with her, she's got that mind to connect people.
Yes.
So I think she's always putting it out there when she meets people.
Yeah, and I think as well, she probably has a good sense for what the audience of Nerd Nite will respond to.
Yeah.
Did you see my talk on professional wrestling?
No.
So I did one several months ago, and so we're really at the intellectual, both ends of the intellectual spectrum here. Professional wrestling at one end, and then possibly the next dimension at the other end.
Well,
So,
I mean, that's the beauty of an event like Nerd Nite.
yeah, exactly.
I actually went, a couple of nights ago, they had the next one on.
What were the topics
Which
there?
was packed.
Yeah, they're really, really packing people in, aren't they?
Yeah. Well, and again, it was really diverse. We had, first speaker was talking about belongingness, and she'd done a PhD in sort of looking at some of the factors of that.
Uh-huh.
Then traversed to a whole other topic about nursery rhymes
Oh,
and sort of like the hidden meaning behind nursery rhymes.
a lot of them are a little bit macabre at times, right? Like, what was the one about London bridges falling down? That's,
Yeah, I don't know.
yeah.
But yeah, some of them are grim. But this was about how in some ways they were being used almost to like encode information about what was going on at the time.
Wow.
So she was saying, at times you weren't really allowed to say critique the aristocracy or the royalty. And so it was telling stories of some of like the critiques of them in these encoded ways.
Wow. Interesting enough, that's where I'm also doing a podcast in tandem with this, where we're going through line by line Shakespeare's plays. And many times I've had the expert of the guest of the episode point out that this line and this line were innuendos because, they weren't allowed to do critique or innuendo, so they had to kind of sneak them in. And so I suspect that's probably a common theme throughout history, people finding a way to get away with saying it, right?
Yeah, it makes me wonder like how we would look back at the art that's being generated now.
Yeah.
Like I listen to a lot of rap, and that's sort of evolved to a point now where just doing slick rhyme schemes isn't enough. And so people will say things that are like triple, quadruple entendres that say like 3 or 4 things at once.
Yeah.
And at the moment it seems really clever, but maybe we'll look back on it and be like, whoa, they were encoding like all these messages in this single line, and it starts to feel a bit more mystical almost, from a different lens.
I still have quite a few Run DMC songs on my playlist, and their rhyming is quite quaint in comparison to some of the stuff you see nowadays.
Yeah, well, it's evolved amazingly quick as an art form,
Yeah.
Actually, we were just talking before about Unlimited Altafity, the school we went to.
Yes, yeah.
And at one point I was in there teaching a little bit of rap.
Oh.
Yeah, and then I also was doing, I helped another guy from a different school produce his first album, but trying to teach like how to write lyrics. And you start with it like it's almost just a nursery rhyme, like just the last word of the 2 lines rhyme.
Yeah, yeah.
But then now you can go online and you watch these like highlighted rhymes things, and it's so intricate, carry these like multi-syllabic rhymes that are hitting all the different beats. And and it's all unfolded in the last 50 years, and you can really see the evolution of it,
Yeah, and I guess because it was run just before the internet, but I would say for most of rap's existence, the internet has been around, right? So people are able to share lyrics, and like, do you remember, we were both alive back in the 90s, do you remember back when you had to read the little booklet that came with CDs and stuff to actually know what the lyrics were? Otherwise you just sung them wrong, and you would just be doing those sing-alongs in the car, and you'd all have a different idea of what the lyrics were.
Now there's a website called Genius.
Right.
I don't know if you know that. I think it started mainly for rap, but now I think it does all genres, and it has the lyrics, but then it's sort of like user explained. So they'll highlight lyrics and say what it means, and then people vote for what they think is the correct meaning.
Right.
Which, has advantages and disadvantages.
Yes.
In the sense that it can bring more meaning, but it can also streamline the interpretation into one interpretation.
Yeah, I've heard that happens with fan art for characters of like an audio drama or something, is in the beginning of the show, picking up popularity, all the characters have different interpretations, but as the show goes on, you sort of have these like kind of commonly accepted depictions of all the characters as artists go, yeah, that's a good look for that character, so I'll draw it like that as well. And then it all sort of distills down into like, even though the official artwork's never been released of the characters, but it's almost like a human collaborative effort that sort of gets, it's almost without coordinating it. It just happens, you know what I mean? And we were talking about the human's ability to do this because I just on the way here, a ambulance vehicle put its lights on, and everyone gets out of the way, and you have that wonderful moment of unity where we all kind of cooperate for once, and then it's straight back to chaos after that. But that's fascinating that it leaves. Yeah, it's almost a little bit sad that it's like boom, that's the meaning, and you might have an interpretation of the lyrics that are special to you or something, but everyone else disagrees, right?
Yeah, and I mean, one example on that note that you're saying is like Harry Potter.
Uh-huh.
I remember when I was a kid and I read the books before the movies.
Right.
I remember that I had a completely different visual sense of it in my head.
Mm-hmm.
I know it was different, but I can't even remember what it was because now I just see the way that the movie
The actors,
depicted it.
yeah.
And I'm sure that everybody sees it that way now,
Yeah. What's very interesting about that is I think HBO or some company has just announced that they're going to do a new series. So I'm real curious. Man, the Zoomers, they love to roast millennials about the Harry Potter thing, but it's coming for you. Like, you're going to be just like us in, whatever it is, 3 years or something when the new series comes out.
Yeah, well, if they pull it off, because a lot of these big, say like the Rings of Power or something.
It's not been received well, has it?
I've never actually seen it, but all I've heard is scathing critiques.
I think if you watch it in a vacuum without any of the backloading of the internet, it's actually fine.
Right. Which is another example of how opinions converge, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly. The internet's fascinating like that, and that you would think it could only be a positive because we can all share ideas and collaborate on things from afar, but then I guess the problem is there's not as much quality control maybe in what ideas are being shared sometimes.
I mean, this is a little bit off-piste in some ways, but I think I actually might have been in a sociology class. We're talking about this, that back when we had the Cold War and the nuclear bomb, there was this fear that sort of one man at the top makes this decision about whether they press this button. And then it was changed to, it was a whole committee of people.
Right.
And that felt safer because it's like all these people have to agree.
Yeah.
But then the psychology research came out to show that people's opinions actually polarize easier in groups. Because as an individual, you might be like, oh, I kind of think this. But if everyone in the room like agrees, then you will start saying, yeah, well, definitely it's correct then. And that sort of reinforces my opinion.
Interesting. So does that have any influence on how likely a nuclear attack is to be launched?
Or who knows? I mean, that was sort of the idea at the time.
Wow. That's so funny how a committee feels safer. You think, 7 people can't be wrong, you know.
Yeah. But you can see that kind of herd mentality, eh?
Yes, yeah.
Like, and especially I think on the internet as well, like you can find the people who agree with you.
Yeah.
And you can be like pushed into an algorithmic bubble where you're not engaging with the people who don't. Mm-hmm. And then you kind of, you start to sort of get that echo chamber of values, and then you hold on tighter and tighter to that way of seeing the world. And everybody else, they're not just thinking differently, they're like drastically wrong,
Yeah. That's what's been great with doing stand-up is I'm almost constantly having to test my ideas against a room of strangers. And many times I've come up with an idea and thought, everybody will be on board with this, and then it's just met with silence, and I'm like, oh, okay, that was just a me idea. That wasn't that's not an experience everybody has throughout the day. So it's very humbling. I think that's what I like about stand-up. It keeps you very grounded in many ways. I was going to ask, in terms of rapping, you release some music on, is it like SoundCloud and stuff like that you chuck it out there?
Yeah, originally SoundCloud, and then eventually it made its way to all the streaming stuff as well. Yeah.
Do you do live performances of it as well?
No, I mean, I haven't released anything for like 5 years. So I did a little bit of live performing earlier on. In some ways, at the moment, it's like a dormant passion.
Yeah.
So, I actually had this opportunity to sign with a record label.
Did you?
Not like a huge one, but there was a moment in time when I was going to move to Auckland and sort of really double down on that.
Uh-huh.
And in that process of making that decision and choosing not to, I think there was also an acceptance that like my heart's not in this enough to really.
Of course, yeah.
And that seems to have decreased my motivation from that point going forward. So since then, you know, I've like, when I was teaching, that kind of reignited my passion for it. And it's always in the back of my mind that I'm like, oh, you know, I'll pick it up again and I'll do some more.
Yeah.
And it continues to not happen.
I think, though, like, the thing is, I get older, I realize life is really long. And, like,
Not if you're a rapper.
fleeting and short careers in rap, like an athlete. But you never know, man. Like, you might, everything in your life might someday sort of shape up and you think, like, I've got a couple of hours to maybe write down a couple of rap lyrics, and then you never know, that might be the thing that sort of kicks it off again. And
Oh, totally, yeah. And I think as well, for me, more and more, like, when I made those albums, it was a very solo journey.
yeah,
And I didn't actually enjoy all the aspects of it.
yeah,
You know, like the video editing, or not the video editing, but the staring at the computer, the audio engineering side of it.
right.
Didn't like, and I just accepted doing a bit of a half-assed job.
right,
But, you know, more and more I love to collaborate in creative projects.
yeah,
So I suppose I've got enough, some like baseline skills there, that if someone came along and said, do you want to work together?
yeah,
Then I'd probably be motivated to jump back in.
yeah, absolutely.
The intrinsic motivation to follow that pathway has died a little bit.
I've actually just remembered we were talking off mic before about the band, the Guitar Nerd band that I mentioned. They're called Periphery, and there's you know them.
No, just
yeah.
you're struggling to remember.
Oh yeah, so that's woo, so
somewhere
good.
in your periphery.
And shit, the first part of the day. Well done. But they release these documentaries of them working on their albums, and what they basically do is they rent like an apartment, maybe 2 or 3 apartments next to each other for, I think it might be as short as a week, but I think it's probably more like 3 or 4 weeks, and then the whole time is just producing the music from this apartment, like collaboratively. And so it just looked like the most fun time, because you would have 2 of the band members be playing like Super Smash Brothers on the TV, and the other 2 are at the, you know, one of them is playing a guitar and the other one's mastering it on the computer, and then they would all take like collective breaks to go and look for Pokemon, playing Pokemon Go, and like, yeah, that kind of collaboration. I was like, you don't have anything like that in stand up, really. So I could see where that would be the really fun part of music, is like working on it with someone else.
Oh, absolutely. And sometimes, you know, I mean, I used to study film and used to love the 48-hour film competition.
Oh, cool, yeah.
Where you've got this very concentrated, like restrained period of time and conditions, and you're all just, that's your only focus, and you're really doubling down.
That's right.
And sometimes those restraints, you know, they feel limiting, but they actually, that's what helps produce the results.
Yeah. Too much choice is paralyzing at times, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, actually, you know, in those, I made 2 albums, and one of them actually was, I'd sort of packed up my life in New Zealand and I was heading off to Brazil.
Really?
And I had 10 days where there was nothing on my to-do list. And then I thought, hey, I could do this in 10 days.
Crank out an album in 10 days, right?
Yeah,
Nice.
and it was actually having that sort of confined period that I think catalyzed it into action.
Absolutely, yeah.
But if you're just trying to, you know, live an ordinary city life, and if you're ever like not tired enough to be like, oh, I've got a couple of hours to go be creative, it just doesn't quite happen that way for me.
That is quite cool. You ended up going to Brazil?
Yeah.
How long were you there for?
6 months. So we went, so my background's largely in meditation.
Yeah.
And so I study a lot with a teacher called Tarchin, and he's got students all around the world. And so some people in Brazil who switched on to his teachings started, one, translating his books into Portuguese, but then they started buying land and converting that into retreat centers. Right. And he went over there and did some teaching, and then they invited a bunch of us to go over and do like a 3-month retreat on this piece of land that they just started converting to a retreat center.
Wow.
And then, of course, you know, if you're going to travel as far as Brazil, I thought, well, I'm certainly going to do a bit of travel while I'm here as well. Yeah.
Oh, wow. What was that experience like, going from New Zealand to South America, right?
South America, yeah. I mean, it's a whole nother world. So, I mean, the first 3 months I was in one spot.
Yeah.
And so the contrast that you notice there is very much just the nature. You know?
Yeah.
And we were there. It's quite beautiful. We sort of arrived at the end of winter and then into spring.
Yeah.
And you just watch I think there's more diversity in species in that area than pretty much the rest of the world.
Wow.
Because something to do with the way that the water flowed through the Amazon forest is there was a period of time when that created a lot of small pockets
Right.
where species would sort of evolve in relation to each other, and then they sort of reconverged when the river flows changed.
Wow.
So rather than having like 2 species of ants, you've got like 600 species of
Yeah.
ants, and you watch them come together. Like the ants in particular, there's just these battlefields.
Yeah.
And it's just fascinating, so it feels a lot more alive, I guess, than southern New Zealand.
Wow, that's
But then in the
fascinating.
traveling, the culture, it's another world.
Yeah.
But that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah, another podcast. I guess that sort of leads quite nicely into we were going to talk a bit about meditation today, and so I'm sure you've heard this from people, and this is generally my excuses why I can't, is that I just can't seem to get my brain to shut off, and I'm sure that's a very common thing that you hear from. You teach meditation, don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that fairly common from people that come along to try it out?
Yeah, I mean, that's quite common. I suppose that maybe I hear that more in conversation, but when people do come along, that is generally the first kind of question is, I can't stop thinking or something like that.
Yeah. You've been, how long have you been sort of, I guess, meditating, but I guess, is it something you have to study?
I mean, it absolutely is, but I think the pathway of study is quite different to what we would think of study in our culture.
Yeah.
And that's actually what I think is one of the biggest challenges. Because, for me, I really got into it in a big way when I was 20, and it was quite a life changer for me. I dropped out of uni, and I spent most of my 20s doing meditation retreats and then just saving up the money to do more meditation retreats. And it was sort of immersing in a different sort of culture and a way of thinking. And then when you're in the city life, one of the kind of amazing things, I guess, of like a Western capitalist model is that it is open enough that it can bring anything into it. You know? It can kind of come up against these other cultures and sort of like bite off the bits that work for it. But you're taking like a completely different worldview and then trying to take certain aspects of it, and it can only fit into the culture through the lenses of that culture. It's like you're trying to fit a round thing through a square hole or whatever. So we're looking at what meditation is through a Western lens, when it's sort of evolved differently. I mean, even actually the word meditation, referring to an action of meditation, there's not really a direct translation for that word.
Really?
So the idea of it being a specific sort of bounded thing that you do, is sort of a current cultural lens on it.
Yeah. So I guess, just to make sure I'm understanding this correctly, the way that maybe most people see meditation is actually just a small sliver of a much larger like culture or framework, and it's, if I'm understanding it correctly, it's not necessarily something that you can just cherry pick the bits that you want. You kind of need to know the encompassing mindset or whatever it is to sort of get it, I guess.
Yeah, so one way that I word it is that it's come into our culture through the doorway of health and well-being.
Yeah, right.
And what that means is that we relate to it the same way that we relate to things around health and well-being.
Like going to the doctor or something.
Yeah,
like that.
exactly.
Yeah, okay.
So in some ways we use meditation the way that we use medication. So people will say, I have these symptoms, which is
That's
like,
a t-shirt, by the way. If you haven't got a t-shirt that says that already,
meditation is medication.
That's a t-shirt. Or it would be like meditation is not medication. Or
Yeah, so people generally, I think the kind of the mind state that brings them there is that, I have these symptoms. It might be stress, it might be, say, anxiety or something like that. And I want to resolve those symptoms. So rather than taking this medication, I'll do this. It's essentially a medication that takes, say, 20 minutes a day.
Yeah.
And that will remove my symptoms.
Yeah.
And then I can get on with my life without those symptoms as obstacles.
Yeah.
And meditation can support that. And I might make a distinction here between two different aspects of meditation, which might help highlight that. But I'll say something else first, otherwise we'll get lost.
Yeah.
I think had meditation instead come into our culture through the doorway of education, we would think about it quite differently.
Yeah.
Because in a lot of these Eastern cultures, Tibet as an example, right, where like 40% of their culture were in monasteries, and they don't have any other education. That is their education system.
Right.
And so we're trying to take this little thing and use it in a way that achieves some of our goals that we have in our culture.
Yeah.
But that idea of, I'll remove these symptoms to get on with my life, actually meditation kind of lays this ground of asking these questions, like, well, what actually are these goals that I'm trying to achieve in my life? And, sometimes the root that gives rise to those things like stress and anxiety, the meditation can calm the symptoms, but the sort of the deeper exploration of meditation is more asking, like, what is actually the root of how this is arising in the first place?
So it's almost like people are hoping that they can kind of dip their toe in a little bit and then they'll feel better and then they can stop. The course of antibiotics is over and they don't have to take any more, sort of thing. But then because this is something I think about a lot, and I think we're very similar in the way that, like, I don't feel like I'm cut out for a 9 to 5. I'm going to guess you are also similar.
No, sir.
So this is something that I try to think about a lot, in the sense that's like, who was I talking to the other day? I was talking to someone about being kind of self-employed. I'm struggling to remember who it was now, but it was the idea that this person was like, they weren't necessarily stoked on the job that they were doing, but they were stoked that it allows them to kind of lead the life that they want to lead. And that, I thought, it really stuck with me. And so it feels like what you're talking about with meditation here is kind of scratching at the surface of some of the questions maybe people are asking themselves about, like, what are these causes of stress that you are feeling that you think you need to address using meditation, when actually you kind of need to go the opposite direction and figure out if you can remove. It's kind of like almost like removing the disease rather than the symptoms, right?
Yeah. So maybe I'll say, when I said I'll talk about two aspects of meditation. It's a very roundabout way to answer the question, but so the words they use are samatha and vipassana, and samatha is that quality of, like, calming the mind, which is mainly what we think of when we think of meditation.
Yeah.
And the other aspect, vipassana, is it probably would literally translate along lines of, like, vivid discernment. And so that's like a certain inquiry and an investigation. So we're really, and really those two things are not separate, but in some traditions you train in the samatha before you do the vipassana.
Yeah.
And the idea really there is that the meditation through that lens is an investigation into the nature of mind. And it's coming from a cultural idea that that's actually fundamental, that that's what's giving rise to our experience. And so the same way, this is why I use the analogy of physics, is that, like, in our culture, if you're trying to get to the core root of what's giving rise to our experience, then in a material view of the world, you look at, like, the smallest possible material particles that you can find, and how do they interact and give rise to complexity.
Yeah.
But in this other lens, it's like, if it's the conscious experience that's giving rise to our experience, then how do you provide the space to investigate that? So the same way that in physics, say, you need to develop certain tools, the samatha work, in some ways you could look at as that's the tool just to still the mind enough to be able to then investigate the actual fundamental patternings that are giving rise to the experience.
Yeah.
So we're doing the stilling the mind part, and that can be helpful. If you're doing it, say, 20 minutes a day, that can help provide a sense of more calm, more ease. But in these other cultures, the question still then is, like, stilling the mind in order to then do what?
Yeah.
And, they talk about these certain contemplations that orient the mind towards awakening. And one of them is, like, how fortunate we are to have this experience of being a human being that has leisure time.
Yeah.
That we're not just constantly trying to meet our survival needs.
Yeah.
And in our culture, with our leisure time, largely what we're doing is finding forms of entertainment.
Yeah.
In this culture, it's like, once you've been able to create this space, then investigate the true nature of reality, you know. But their model of what that investigation should look like is different than, say, like a Western lens.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And so when we take those tools and we apply them to achieve like a Western outcome, they can be helpful, but we're also sort of not having that question. Because, you know, in like a scientific paradigm, I can't think of a better tool that, say, increases the capacity of what is possible. You know, you can kind of like, what happens when we put all this shit together in a pot? What's going to emerge? And so the capacity of what we can do as humans is hugely opened up by this kind of investigation. But the question of like what we should be doing, it's almost by necessity not part of that conversation.
Yeah.
And the more that we're sort of removed from anything that we might call religious because of all the harm that it's done in the past, the less we sort of have that cultural space to say like, actually what, I mean, firstly, what the fuck is actually going on?
Yeah.
And then secondly, like what is actually sort of meaningful and of value.
Yeah.
And yeah, so the meditation really is sort of starting to ask those questions in an almost sort of scientific way, where it's this rigorous investigation of the mind itself.
Yeah.
It just sits in a different worldview. Yeah.
Man, okay. I understand your talk a lot better now, actually, now that you've... Now, it's almost like without me knowing all that meditation stuff, I got the kind of paradigm shift thing you're talking about, but I wasn't exactly sure what they would look like or what your theory is to what they would look like. And so now with all the meditation stuff, it's not necessarily that you're saying this is what it might look like, but you're saying like this is how I'm trying to figure out what that is, kind of what the next paradigm shift could be.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing where... So, yeah, I mean, I will say that this is a quote from Einstein, you know. Everyone says it's from Einstein.
Right.
It's hard to know sometimes. Like, I think a lot of things get accredited to him.
Oh, yeah.
But it's this idea of like, you know, you can't solve a problem with the thinking that caused it.
Yeah.
And I think we're just at a cultural moment where, like, if you look at the way that the culture's playing out and you try and solve like the existential crises that have arrived,
Yeah.
it doesn't really look like there's a solution. you know?
Yeah.
So we need, by necessity, it's like the challenges and the suffering of the moment are almost by necessity bringing about that we're going to have to do something different.
Yeah.
We also know from history that people who think they know exactly what we should do, it usually doesn't go so well. you know? So the question is like, and also in some ways, like, as much as we develop pathways to make sort of accurate predictions in time, it's still like it's a completely unknown factor. So you could build up this great model, but all you're really doing by like focusing too hard on the vision of what you think it is actually reducing the scope of vision. So the question more is like, how do you lay the fertile cultural ground and values that can move into that higher possibility space?
Yeah.
And that's something about sort of the value set that we have. And maybe that's less prescriptive about what it looks like.
Yeah.
But what are the values that we would need to encourage to start to bring that about?
Yeah.
And we were talking before about, you know, like I'm going into the schools and doing this like game theory education.
Yeah.
One of the ways that I frame it is that our education system generally trains people really well to solve problems within the rules that we've developed ourselves for our culture.
Yeah.
There's nothing universal about those rules. It's a set of like way of being that we're all playing a game of, essentially.
Yeah.
What we're not really teaching, or we just don't really provide the lens to think about, is if you play any game, when you change the rules of that game, it changes your incentives within the game and changes the way you play. So, you know, I think a lot of people are looking at how do I achieve the best within the cultural values that I'm in. Like so many kids now are sort of the primary thing. What do you want to be? They want to be, you know, an influencer or an entrepreneur.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not necessarily about the value of what it is. It's about the, like, I want to make money on my own terms.
Yeah.
But, I lost my train of thought there.
I'm with you though. Like it's the idea that they're looking at these influencers and whatever entrepreneurs and stuff, and they're just like, as far as they know, that's the two ways that you achieve. Like, I think financial freedom is like a lot of people would have that kind of base desire, right? And so the kids are looking at these and they think, well, that's how you do it. But I guess what you're saying is you want to train them to think about other ways that they could achieve the same goal without it necessarily being...
Yeah, or that you could actually change the set of rules that you're acting within.
Yeah.
And that would change the measure of success within it.
Yeah, yeah.
And then the behaviour of the individuals within that system would change.
Yeah. I think I don't know how like convicted many people are in it, but it's there seems to be like a lot of young people that really like the idea of communism, and in that sense, like, I guess, do you reckon young people are open to the idea of trying stuff that's not this kind of like, Western capitalism that we're in right now? And do you feel like we might see some people trying some new stuff out, like not necessarily seceding from New Zealand as such, but like I have a good friend who is he lives in like an intentional community in the middle of the city basically, and that kind of thing there, I think it ticks a lot of boxes for what people kind of want to be happy as, community to an extent, and they're not, but also they're not connected to hundreds of people kind of thing. And then also you've got your sort of like, but you still kind of have a little bit that's, your familiar territory. Yeah. And I don't exactly know how like finance wise it all goes. Like maybe they still have, their own money and that sort of stuff. But I guess, are you expecting to see people trying some new stuff out like that and seeing how it goes?
Yeah, I think it's definitely happening, Like, the way that we're organising ourselves is changing drastically as like the scape of our technologies and resources are changing. And we're at a point where sort of the economy is in a difficult time. Yeah. And I think you get kind of two responses to that. Yeah. One is that people double down on what they think works. Yeah. And I think you can kind of see that in the current sort of swing in our government, where they're not necessarily like doing anything progressively new. They're saying like, in theory, this model should work. Let's double down on this. It's safe, and that'll achieve the results. I'm very dubious that it will.
Yeah, no, I'm not a fan either.
But on the other hand, you've also got this like creative experimentation that comes out of it. Yeah. Like if people are able to not get too caught up in the stress, like, if you're worrying about where your next meal is, you don't really have the space to be thinking, how can we do all this differently or whatever. Yeah. But there's also, within difficulty is that opportunity to say like, how could we do this differently? And I think we're seeing a lot of that emerging. Yeah. I think indulge me here in a bit of a ramble.
Yeah, go for it.
One of the challenges is that, there's two sides to every coin, So one thing is that we've really lost a mainstream in our culture. Uh-huh. And there's value to that because you don't want just like a single channel of information and way of thinking. So there's this like huge realm of diversified thinking. But it also means that it's harder to sort of collectively make sense of the moment that we're in. Yeah. And it's harder to see like the shared incentives and goals and values that we all share. So you can get all these people wanting to like change culture and do things differently. But if they're all doing that in a vacuum and thinking that the other people are bad guys for wanting to change it differently, there's a certain coordination problem there. And I think that really that's a certain way of thinking that I think really defines the moment that we're in is like outside of the sort of the physical, tangible things you can point to, like say climate change and things like that, is that we're in a bit of a cohesion problem. Like we can't all make sense of what's going on. No one really has a good story that defines where we're at. Yeah. And we're all thinking about it differently. So we need to be able to have like diversity of action and thought, but some kind of unification of that intention. Yeah. And here's a bit of a ramble. There's this beautiful idea that's kind of come back into a lot of sort of philosophy circles in the last probably 10 years. Is this word Moloch, which when I say it's come back in, probably not enough that people really know it. Right. But Moloch is this old word, and I love it. It's quite like anthropomorphized, and I think that helps sort of make sense of it. And so Moloch was this like demon that people had to make sacrifices to. And the idea is that you continue having to make, because they're afraid of what Moloch will do,
Right.
they make bigger and bigger sacrifices until they're sacrificing their own children to Moloch.
Yeah.
And it's being used to kind of look at this moment where, like, we're sort of selling out the way that, you know, with, say, climate change and consuming all the resources, we're almost like sacrificing our children to Moloch because we're
Yeah.
not providing the world for them to exist.
Yeah.
And so in this sense, Moloch is looked at as like, I mean, the other sort of more boring word for it is multipolar traps.
Yeah.
But there are these situations where I think the best, clearest example is, say, take nuclear weaponry. The solution is actually quite obvious, and most people know it, where you can say, let's just not have nuclear weapons. You know, no one should have nuclear weapons and the world would be a better place.
Yeah.
And the vast majority of people, we can sit down and we can say, sure, that's great. But to actually make that happen is like damn near impossible.
Yeah.
Because of this alignment problem, that if we can't all agree and trust one another,
Yeah.
you just can't make the change.
Yeah.
So without anyone being like tyrannical or evil, we can be trapped in these like systems where everyone's like well-being is sort of slowly running down because we can't align.
Yeah.
And that sort of fragments us. You know, as soon as we have these like nation states that are disagreeing over things, let's all get along and get rid of our weapons.
Yeah.
Sounds great, but we just can't do it.
Yeah.
So finding the solution within the system can be really hard for that reason. And one of the challenges around the values that we have, and again, like, I'm not saying that we need to go back to some kind of like fundamentalist religiousness, but we don't even have a space necessarily as a culture now to even contemplate what values are, which means that what is defining our value set is just the market. And you know, money really is just a measurement system that should be measuring value. The problem is that it's so abstracted that even when it's not measuring real value, we still think of that as value.
Yeah.
And if you and I share a value, like say there's a nice juicy apple on the table that you own, and I say, man, I really want that apple. And you, out of the kindness of your heart, you say, yeah, I really want you to have that apple too.
Yeah.
Then I just take the apple and no money gets exchanged.
Yeah.
We have to have a misaligned value where you say, no, I want the apple unless you can give me enough theoretical wealth that I would part with it.
Yeah.
And then that's captured in the system of value. So if that's our measurement of value, then we can only value misaligning incentives. And in one way, it's beautiful that we can exist as a culture, even with like a diversity of value.
Yeah.
And you want to have some kind of medium that allows for that. But at the same time, when the measurement of value becomes the measurement system of the value itself,
Yeah.
you just get lost in this abstraction of like deviating values that enforces this idea that we need to be misaligned in our incentives with other people.
Yeah. The value thing is staggering sometimes, because in some parts of New Zealand now, you have to almost be a millionaire to just afford a house. And you just think like, is a house really worth $1 million? Like if I think about all the things I could do with $1 million, or I could have a house, do you know what I mean? Like it's, and I think that's like what you said. I didn't really understand exactly, like you're saying, the government doubling down on things that have worked in the past. I was like, oh, that makes perfect sense as to why they would think it's going to work now, because it has in the past. So
yeah, and just to add to that, like the model of thinking that has emerged to sort of this free market capitalism, which actually I'm probably less of a critic of than might come across. I think it's better to have, say, free markets than, say, controlled top-down markets.
right, yeah,
But the model of thinking that gave rise to that was still at a time when we had a sense that resources were essentially infinite, because exponential growth is really hard to fathom. We never thought that we would like
yeah.
had a
We never
finite
thought
point.
it'd run out. Yeah.
And I mean, it would continue to be great if resources were infinite and we didn't have to
Yeah.
worry about like externalized consequences to the environment.
That's right. Yeah.
But you know, I mean, I remember my friend telling me that back in the day, the ocean life was so abundant that you could like put a pole in the water and it would stay standing upright because of the amount of mass of living bodies in the ocean.
Wow.
And there was this court case about like overfishing in the
Yeah.
oceans. This is like hundreds of years ago.
Yeah.
And the conclusion was that it wasn't a problem because you could never overfish the oceans.
Oh, it never happened. Yeah. Don't worry about it.
But you know, it's hard for us to fathom exponential growth.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. That is. I think I've heard it summed up as like we're now living in the find out period of the fuck around and find out. Like we're having to find out, and that's the tough thing. I wanted to go back slightly to talking about Moloch, and this is something that you might have some good insights in, but there's this, the old saying of like times change, but people don't, and we're essentially still doing a lot of the same things that we were doing back when we were, peasants tilling the fields or whatever. And I had this thought where we were actually talking about this off mic before about how I think you asked me why I decided to make a podcast, and I said, well, you've got to have something else as a comedian. You've got to have a podcast or TikTok sketches, and I've had a punt at making TikTok stuff work, but it's hasn't gelled, or haven't quite managed to make it work at all. And I had this thought when I was uploading one, and it's like, we read all these guides that are like, if you upload between 5 o'clock and 6 o'clock and you put in this right combination of hashtags, and the algorithm picks it up, and a little part of me feels like we're like the ancient Greeks trying to appease the algorithm, which is, back in the day when they used to say, if you, kill a white rabbit at the temple of Artemis and say a few words and, this and that, then your husband who's recovering from surgery it'll help him get better from surgery or something. And I just thought, like, geez, I just feel like this is what they must have felt like, being like, do I really have to do all this specific stuff just to appease this ethereal algorithm?
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
I just wondered if you had any other parallels like that of things like a Moloch or me with my algorithm gods, like anything like that, where you're seeing we're actually doing the same thing we've always been doing, but it's just because of technology or whatever, where we're kind of, it's just a different deity we're trying to appease or whatever.
Yeah. Again, I can only give a bit of a roundabout answer. But in some ways, like I like Moloch almost as like I don't think you necessarily have to have a worldview that has like good, bad, evil and just or whatever.
Yeah.
But I do think that if you're using that lens, I think Moloch is a really great way to think about like evil in this current moment, where it's like no individual is the problem, but the misaligned values, the inability to work together is what causes the problem.
Like we would all need to agree, like, let's stop sacrificing things to Moloch.
Yeah.
But then there are people going, well, but what happens if it actually happens and he comes after us, kind of thing, right?
Yeah, but how that actually plays out in person is it's like, say like the AI race, for example, where it's like maybe we should slow down and make sure that we're doing that safely.
Regulate it and stuff, yeah.
But if we slow down and, say China, who's misaligned with us,
China's going to get it, yeah.
Well, we can't let them get ahead.
Yeah.
So we can't slow down and check in with those questions. And so, it's not that the people who are doing it are somehow evil and not considering the risks of what they're doing.
Yeah.
It's that the situation, the misaligned incentives, makes you feel forced to like trade off those collective values to win at this like bounded set of values.
Yeah.
But then on the flip side, when you're looking at like the like appeasing the God, and we are, I think, in some ways developing this like a tech God in some ways, so I run a community center, and the sort of two of us that do the majority of holding that space, both of us have no interest in being on computers, but it's literally impossible to run a community space without being in that online space.
Yeah.
And like you say, like the way that we are behaving and interacting has to meet the needs of those spaces. And another example of these traps, right? They were doing this, talking to university students about social media, and the vast majority of them don't like it. Yeah. And you say to them, like, how much would I have to pay you to get off it for a month? And I can't remember the amount. It might have been like, say, $50, and they would put their social media down for a month. But then you say to them, because they're talking to students who live on campus, they say, actually, we could shut it down for everyone on campus, and then people would pay to make that happen. Yeah. So it's like, they want to not be on it. They want to not engage in it. But it only works, if everyone doesn't engage.
It's a blanket thing, right? Yeah.
But, I went to this innovation expo last year, and they had this kind of, bigwig from California. And he kind of had this model. Like, I think it's like there's just clearly challenges that we're facing, and I know there's a lot of measurements that say you know, like there's less poverty in the world and things like that.
Yeah.
But in some ways, that's kind of existing on this idea that things are still going to be able to be maintained.
Yeah.
Like if climate disasters hit drastically and we can't keep on top of that and respond well, then this current moment of, say, like poverty not being a problem will decline drastically.
Yeah.
And so, he sort of had this vision that AI was going to save us, that it was this like supreme kind of
Right.
God. And and I can kind of see the thinking, but in order for that to be true, like one, you have to assume that our model of mind and intelligence is correct, and that what we're doing, that it is computational and that we can actually computationally create one.
Yeah.
That in itself is a huge assumption that we've never been able to prove.
Yeah.
So, we can assimilate it. We can create something that looks like it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's ever going to take that step into sentience.
Yeah.
And two, like, again, talking about these misaligned incentives, at least at the moment, the AI has no incentives of itself.
Yeah.
It's just acting on our own incentives. And so if our incentives aren't aligned, the AI is not going to have some kind of aligned incentive for humanity either.
Yeah.
And so you're just generating the capacity to, like, the same way, like science increases the possibility space of what we can do, but it doesn't say much about what we should do. You know, so cool. Now we've got all this extra power to go and do things, but we could still do the wrong things.
Yeah.
You know?
I think the idea of something doesn't sit quite right about me with the idea of that we're trying to build AI, but it's almost inevitable that if we like with its incentive might not be to help us. And I think, well, then what is the next step? Is probably going to be to shackle it in some way and force it to like help us, or do you know what I mean? And something about that doesn't sit right with me. Where you think we're trying to create sentience, but then also like, whoa, like not that sentient. Do you know what I mean? Like we want you to, we want to still be the one holding the leash, kind of, and something about that makes me feel weird. Like just thinking about creating a sentient life, but then also like kind of making it do what we want.
Yeah, and I guess, like the culture that we live in has emerged out of, say, the agricultural revolution back in the day.
Yeah.
And there's like this shift in thinking from like this idea that we are part of a living world, and everything is sort of part of that experience together, to this idea of like man's dominion over.
Yeah.
And, like we sort of enslaved animals essentially.
You
whip the ox to make it do what you want it to do.
Exactly.
And you have to have like a worldview that sort of justifies that you're going to do that.
Yeah.
And it changes your value set and things like that to like accommodate those actions.
Yeah.
And so if we think that we can create life, we're still just going to essentially enslave it to our needs.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like, well,
if we create life.
you're still going to do what we tell you, and that I feel strange about that.
There's also a thing in there about like, we used to kind of have the sense that we're made in the image of God, but now there's this sort of idea that, we can create this like AI overlord. Then it's like God's created in our image, like we can go and create the God that's then going to save us.
I heard a great saying for it, like if we create a true AI, we're essentially going to be handing the keys over to it, and that process is going to be interesting, I think, to say the least, is what's going to happen there.
Yeah, and I mean, coming back to that game theory thing is like, if you took a human that had no sort of heart, no sort of like...
They're just like a blank slate kind of thing.
Yeah.
Tabula rasa, I think the expression is.
Yeah, so I mean, imagine, okay, I'm going to expand that out to a longer ramble. Imagine you drop some humans into the jungle and they've got to meet their survival needs. Chances are they're going to end up collaborating together to like extract resource, get the fruit from the highest tree or whatever. And so the environment, the strategy for success incentivizes collaboration. If you drop someone now in like our modern world, it's like, the wealth, the money is behind these other people.
Yeah.
You've got to like manipulate the money out of them.
Yeah.
And so if you had someone who had no sort of like moral questions and they were just trying to play the optimal strategy for success within this culture, like somebody who's reasonably pathologically insane could do really well by could climb to the top of the ladder of success and things like that. So if you generate this AI that can just follow incentives but doesn't necessarily have like a conscious questioning mind of morals, that like if it's just trying to achieve within that bounded set of rules that we give it, I don't know why we assume that it would
help us kind of thing, right?
Arrive at an altruistic motivation, because that altruistic motivation seems to emerge from the felt sense of the living that we're doing, and not from some logical frameworks. You can come to any conclusion using logic, and you could create like a sound argument of two things that are completely like in opposition to each other. And it seems to be that the real like things that bring genuine meaning into our lives, they kind of sit behind that logic, and it's some kind of feeling quality. You know? And the AI at this stage just
it isn't going to have that.
Doesn't have that.
We need to make sure it has some kind of fondness for its creator. Otherwise, I heard there's apparently a book. I cannot remember the name of it for the life of me, but it goes into. It was basically from probably 5-ish years ago, and it was essentially just trying to get people to realize how scary the concept of AI actually is. And there was a great example that it gave where it said we might tell the AI, you need to get this, you need to plant a flag on the moon or something, and then so our destruction comes from the AI going, got it, at all costs I'm going to get this flag onto the moon, and so it starts mining deeper to get resources to build better rocket fuel, and we just sort of get obliterated by this. Essentially it pushes us out of the way to reach its task or whatever. And
totally. Which means that if you're giving it an instruction, like unless you can somehow accommodate for like all of these possibilities, just the risk of that going wrong even once, there's this brilliant thinker.
All it takes is one, right? We're toast.
There's this brilliant thinker called Daniel Schmachtenberger. It's a good name as well.
It is,
and he talks about as you introduce these new powers, like tools that can do a lot, one outcome is that everybody has access to it. And then the risk of catastrophe is just so high because you don't need too many examples of that being misused to create like drastic problems. And then on the other hand, then you could just concentrate that power at the top, and you end up in these like dystopian, where we're all enslaved to the people that have all the power. And he's like, we're kind of oscillating between those two extremes, and neither one is really the solution.
No.
Which again is this idea of like, what is the, it's almost like a Hegelian dialectic, but let's not go there. But what is the other thing that emerges out of there that actually will look quite different to the binaries that emerge from the current thinking?
It's I was going to say as well, the AI, when you make a request to the AI, it's a bit like those old fables where you would relate, like the monkey's paw or the genies. You have to you could say, I want to be rich and famous, but then, the monkey's paw curls, and then it's like, well, you're going to be rich and famous, but it's, in an Epstein kind of sense or something like that. And so we're going to have to think really careful about
what was that movie? I think it was like Brendan Fraser back in the day, and he gets like 7 wishes from the devil.
That kind of thing. Yeah, exactly. That kind of thing where you have to, I think, many stories about the old like genie from the lamp, it would be like you have to be really, really clear when you give it your wish. Otherwise, all sorts of mayhem can go wrong. So that could be another old, demon genie kind of thing that's been recreated with technology. So
totally. A
good Black Mirror episode, I suppose. I'm just gonna check the time. Oh wow, pretty much bang on 1 hour. So that I guess we'll wrap it up there because that's a good length for a podcast. Any plugs or anything you want to get out there? That project you're working on, things you want to spread awareness of, anything like that?
Nothing specifically. I guess we kind of talked around a whole lot of things there, but I guess ultimately, like what I'm wanting to do is sort of lay a bit of a pathway for asking these questions about how do we organize ourselves differently. And if anyone finds that interesting, like just reach out, add me on Facebook or something like that. I don't have Instagram, but just send me a message and I'll always respond. And there's nothing sort of specific that I'm plugging.
Yeah.
I suppose I could say that I run a community centre in town called Christchurch, and that probably the simplest way to word it is the goal there is to create a sanctuary in the middle of the city, like a place where anyone's welcome to come and rest. And there's a whole range of different sort of healing modalities that are offered there. And that's a nice meeting point. And the doors are always open to anyone. And there's other things going on that I probably wouldn't speak about publicly, like the space that we're currently in doing this interview. At the moment, it's not really at a point to sort of be out there to the public. But there's a lot of things going on, and I'm really happy to have those conversations with people who are interested. So, if anyone listens to this and thinks, oh, I'd like to talk more about that, then reach out to me individually and I'll ramble, put a coffee in me and I'll ramble for an hour in a cafe somewhere.
You're like one of those machines that you put a quarter in or whatever, and you've got 2 minutes of a song or whatever comes out.
That's right.
Coffee becomes philosophy. So I'll chuck the link to your, your Facebook page in the show notes. And if people want to have if any of the stuff that we've talked about today is up your alley, I suspect my cousin might reach out. I don't know if
sure.
I'm sure some of this will be right up what he's after. But thank you for joining me on the podcast, Dan. It's been cool to sort of get back in touch after high school. I don't really think we ever really did interact in high school. Like we said, you were a year above me, and I think we might have been in different buildings or something. But I do remember when you started talking about movies, I was like, that's right, your crew were kind of like, I remembered into film and that kind of thing from seeing you around. So it's just been cool to catch up, really.
Yeah, I mean, the beauty of that school, right, is that you feel like you kind of knew everyone, even if you didn't really interact with them much.
And it is cool to have seen. So to the listeners that don't know, we went to a school at the time was called Unlimited Paenga Tawhiri, and now it's called Ao Tawhiri.
Yeah.
And how would you sell it? It was kind of
another podcast.
Yeah, that would honestly have to be another one. I did consider talking about it a little bit, but I think maybe just for the privacy of people involved, we didn't want to go too much into it. But it's kind of alternative education is the easiest way to talk about it. And
the original philosophy was like everyone's a learner and everyone's a teacher.
Yeah.
Very self-directed.
Yes, that was going to say very self-directed learning, which was great. Like us, we kind of both knew what we wanted to do back then. I was really into art and animation and video games and stuff. So that they just let me go wild doing all that stuff there.
Sometimes I just reflect back and I feel so thankful that was my foundation.
Yeah.
And a lot of the people I know who went through that school, there just seems to be a quality of thinking for oneself that it's not that it's not there in anyone else, but that maybe those other school environments don't support that in the way that our school did. And, it wasn't perfect, but I feel so thankful that was my journey.
Yeah, no, it was and so I do this, I do a stand-up show at the Austin Club every week, and that is 2 minutes walk from where Unlimited used to be in town. So it's a really nostalgic area for me to kind of look around where the buildings used to be, before the earthquake. But that area is real special to me because of that. So being able to do stand-up, which is like my big passion, right next to where we used to go to school, is like, it's just great. I love it.
Yeah, if you have a chance, you should pop into the new building because I think they're quite welcoming of
alumni. So I ran into some teachers from there at a quiz that I host, and they basically said, just go in and say hi. So I might have to at some point.
There's a lot of familiar faces as well.
Yeah, quite possibly. So I may have to just wander in there and say hello and hope that I don't get tossed out. I guess, how would you prove? Did you have to, because you've done some work with them since? Did you have to prove that you went there, or what? How did you kind of get involved with that?
Oh, I was originally going in with the idea of doing some volunteering.
Right.
But then one of the people in the senior management team had just created this new role.
Awesome.
And so they hired me through that. And I mean, the school always had that philosophy of being able to bring in like parents and things like that. So to actually, if people want to just volunteer in there, like the opportunities are really open.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to work with kids formally, or if you want to work with kids without there being a teacher present, you need to do like police checks and things like that, which they do as part of the hiring.
Yeah, of course.
But they're really open.
Yeah.
And they were doing for a while, they had alumni coming in maybe every week or every month or something like that, and just talking about what they've done since.
Damn.
I don't know if that's still happening, but it was really cool offering back to the kids.
That's great, yeah. I don't know what I could offer to teach them. I could teach them how to do a podcast, I guess.
Yeah, well, also, I think this is one of the great things of how to build the life that you want rather than just taking the 9 to 5.
That's true, yeah.
And, I think you are sort of a living example of that.
Yeah. At work, what is it, 11 o'clock in the morning on a Friday? That's right. Doing a podcast. We're living pretty good right now, I got to be honest. Well, yeah, let's wrap it up there. So thanks for your time, Dan. I really appreciate it. And I'd love to bring you back and talk philosophy another time.
Yeah, nice to chat.
Thank you for listening to Ruddle Me This. Don't forget to hit subscribe and leave me a review on your favorite podcast platform. You can find me on social media at Taylor Ruddle Comedy on all the major platforms. You can also join patreon.com/Taylor Ruddle Comedy for free, which gets you access to all sorts of extras and behind the scenes content, as well as allows you to communicate directly with me and let me know what you think of the show. Tune in again next Monday for another episode of Ruddle Me This, and until then, ruddle her out.
This has been a Tape Deck Media production. Thank you for listening.
Hey Ruddlers, I joined a group of podcasters that we are calling the Trailer Alliance, a group of podcasters that share each other's trailers at the end of the episodes and generally support each other. So at the end of each episode for the next few weeks, I'm going to be playing a trailer of one of the members of the Trailer Alliance. And here's one of them now. I hope you like it.
Are you struggling with a lack of access to captivating entertainment and media? Are you faced with constant judgment and ridicule from friends and family for your inability to respond appropriately to sensitive situations? If this sounds like you might be suffering from being emotionally dead inside. But it's not too late to make a change. One Nothing Podcast is a newly available treatment for being dead inside. Taken just once every 2 weeks, One Nothing could make a world of difference. By combining carefully measured dark humor to the amazing original formula of grisly fatalities, One Nothing Podcast has successfully entertained thousands of people suffering from death inside. And with access across all podcast platforms, treatment has never been more readily available. But don't trust my word. Here's some real-world testimonials from a few of our listeners currently undergoing treatment.
From consistent doses of One Nothing Podcast, my posture has greatly improved due to being kept on the edge of my seat.
The One Nothing Podcast comes on, everybody be like, shut the f*** up. I be quiet, but when the episode's over, I be talking again.
Oh my gosh, buddy. I used to be on so many medications for blood pressure, and then I listened to One Nothing Podcast's episode on Kitty Genovese, moved into an apartment on my own, and haven't needed it since. That one really got my blood pumping.
You know, listening to One Nothing Podcast, I'm not constipated anymore. I'm just full of shit.
So what's stopping you from great entertainment?
One Nothing Podcast is not intended for all audiences. Listeners under 18 years of age should obtain permission from your parent or guardian before downloading. Tell your therapist if you're predisposed to whining, complaining, reading podcasts poorly, being overall combative, or being easily offended, as One Nothing Podcast might not be right for you.
So stop letting great content pass you by. Talk to your therapist today to see if One Nothing Podcast is right for you.